What's going on, Soul Tribe? And welcome to Alchemist Astrology. Justin here, and are you ready to get into those lunar shenanigans? Because it's an interesting one that's happening here. It's kind of a mixed bag that's going on there. The moon starts off with these more positive aspects, but they're I think it's like trying to find the abundance and trying to find the joy in things. It's requiring a little bit more effort, than I think than normal. And then we get into these little challenging pockets there. It's like we got this goodness, and then it's like a sandwich, and then but the meat's weird. And so we got to navigate that one. But before we get into all of that, if you're new here, again, my name is Justin, and one of the things that I do on this is talk about the astrology of the moon, and that's going to be what sign it's in, what phase it's in, when it happens to go void of course, and the to get a feel of the energies as the moon is having these different conversations with these celestial bodies and distributing these energies. The moon is very closely associated with the masses and with us, and there's this deep connection, having how the moon even goes around us. So there's that deep connection there. So it's good to sync up with that good old moon. Now, one housekeeping thing before we get into this, if you want to help support the work that I'm doing, I have a link down in the description box below for my Patreon page. And on there there are two tiers where if you tier one gives you access to the Lucky Day podcast, and that talks about the most auspicious days for each month, so that you can, whatever you're wanting to initiate, that it'll provide the dates for you to kind of support that endeavor. And then the second tier includes the podcast plus a personalized transit report from me. I will send a video that will talk about the trends that are coming up, where there are going to be some smooth pockets and some things where there's flow and ease, and where there may be a little bit more bumps and some challenges and things, and how to navigate those energies. So if that's something that you're interested in, definitely go check that out. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing. There, look at that full moon. That moon's looking good. So yeah, I'm going to be covering the week of November 4th through the November 10th, 2025. So let's jump into this thing here. Let's get into Tuesday, because it's nice. Tuesday starts off on the 4th of November. Now, before the moon moves into Aries, the moon's in Aries. Before it moves into Taurus, the moon is first going to form a square with Big Papa. And that's nice. It's going to happen exactly a little bit after midnight, at about 12:25 p.m. Pacific or a.m. Pacific time. And when you think about the squares, that's when the celestial bodies are 90 degrees apart from one another. And those can be a bit more challenging. There can be these inharmonious aspects. They create this disharmony sometimes. They're kind of martial in nature. But the nice thing is that it's with the benefics that the moon is having this conversation. So what may be, how this could potentially show up is like the moon is, there, it's like how to find the abundance maybe when there are challenges that are happening, because even though the moon is just entered into its place of exaltation, which is really nice, Mars has shifted. And so now Mars is in it. As you see here, Mars just entered into Sagittarius, not too long after the moon, or just before the moon entered into Taurus. And so this is a different energy that's in the mix. Things are cooking up. This is a busy week. This is going to be where the first retrograde is going to be happening with Mercury, and then that's building up to that conjunction there. And so with all of that, and how that's translating in the world, with all of that, the challenge may again to be try to how to find that release from the bonds that Jupiter provides. It's how to find that, to keep that trust and faith, that bigger things are coming. It's how to keep that hope, and I think that it comes with one kind of banding together, because and that's where that moon opposing Venus, I think, kind of comes in there. It's the oppositions are a bit tougher than the squares. They're where the celestial bodies are 180 degrees apart from one another, so in opposite signs from one another. But again, it's Venus, and this may be where how do you there can people got a lot I've been talking with some people in my life, and they're going through some challenging things, and to have to try to create that space for them to talk about their things, and then how to bring the laughter, how to bring the joy when there are these kind of challenging things happening with Venus, and when we got things going on in our personal lives, maybe things that are going on in our cities. The moon is more than just like what we're feeling. The moon represents some very tangible things. We're dealing with the body, deals with the city, the home space. It can deal with like your siblings, your possessions, your goods. So these are some things to kind of pay attention to. That might even be something where, when the moon is feeling, personally, when we're talking personally, when the moon's maybe feeling kind of challenged, how do you soothe? What are them, what, because the moon can represent receipts, how does that look like? Because that might be something where maybe there's it almost feels like a challenge of that kind of immediate gratification versus long-term gratification, because that's how I would describe that sort of like that difference between Venus and Jupiter, just thinking about their movement. Venus moves more regularly. It doesn't go as retrograde as often as Jupiter does. Jupiter does it once a year, but Venus is moving. Venus goes like every other year. And so, there's a consistency with Venus where Jupiter delivers, it delivers like it's like Santa, it's, but when it does, it delivers big, depending on whether you have a day versus a night chart, of course. But that's what this transit kind of feels like. There's goodness there, and it doesn't feel like that sort of like general, just like, of course we want to appreciate, the health that we have, the family that we have, the things that we have, of course, all of those things. But it's like, obviously we want more for those things. We want those things to improve, or we want those things to sustain. And that might be another thing with the challenge, how to sustain the abundance. But I think it's not worrying, I don't want to say necessarily worrying about it going away, because there are things that can be, real challenges that come through there. But knowing that, maybe it wasn't the things. I've moved around a lot, and I had some really kind of drastic changes over the last few years. But it really showed me the things that stuck. It really showed where my values were, what I appreciate, and what really nurtures me, So this can be a really nice energy. And then the moon moves into Taurus at about, and then we had that's some deep contemplation to have between between midnight and 8 a.m. A lot of heavy philosophizing here. But then the moon moves into Taurus at about 8:15 a.m. Pacific time, and that's where the moon's exalted. The moon is doing strong in Taurus. The moon's feeling grounded in Taurus. It's a Venusian sign, and it's ruled by Venus. It's the fixed earth sign, and it's one of the nocturnal signs, so it's receptive when we're thinking about Taurus. And Taurus, I like to think about it as going at the pace of nature. I have the chart up here where the moon's at 0 degrees of Taurus, and and again, this is under the rulership of Venus, who's still, finishing up its last little chapter here in its home sign of Libra. So at least the moon gets to appreciate that niceness for a little bit, like while it's in its state of exaltation, because it's like, and that's nice because they both move out of these signs at the same time, and I think that there's these next couple of days, let this be a stabilizing energy. Set roots, like try to, we have Mercury retrograde coming, there's Jupiter retrograde that's coming, Mars is changed signs, Mercury, like it's Venus is going to change signs, the moon's changing signs all the time, so it's like there's a lot of activity that's going to be happening. So just something to think about, a lot to kind of talk about in that first bit. But then we get into Wednesday. It's the 5th of November, and we get to the full moon. That's going to happen at about 5:19 a.m. Pacific time, and that's when the moon and the sun are opposed to one another, an opposite sign, and that's going to happen at degree-wise at about 13 degrees and 22 minutes of Taurus. So again, something to pay attention to. That's actually squaring my ascendant. That's something to keep in mind up there. But you know what I plan on doing? I plan on being outside. I'm going to look at that moon, because something to think about with this moon, when it does rise later that evening, the moon, a lot of cool things actually, I think. One, this is where the moon's in its perigee right now. So it's really close, it's closest to the earth. And I love that that's happening while the moon is in its exaltation. I think there's something really nice there, something powerful, something captivating, I think, about the moon. And I think that this is a great time to, when you think about the sun opposite the moon, that's like the soul's, the moon is reflecting the soul's light. So this could be a great time to just during the full moon just kind of take a moment and just kind of look at yourself, and just kind of look at the things that have that are in your world, that are regular in your that are in your sphere. This is happening between fixed signs. What are things that are, and how do we feel about them? How do we feel about the things that you've amassed with that moon in Taurus? How do we think about certain possessions? Are there some there's other certain things that are no longer represent who you are? This could be looking at maybe your attachment to clothing, things like that, because that moon is sextiling Jupiter, which is really nice too. I actually have that one on the chart here. If you're watching the video, that happens at about 12:40 p.m. But I think sometimes in order to make space for more abundance, sometimes we have to get rid of some things, and that's where even really the malefics come in, where they're taking away things, but it doesn't have to always be bad. Sometimes we can volunteer, instead of things being taken from us, sometimes we can just voluntarily make space for new things to come, and you go to get rid of some shirts, or maybe you got to go to donate some clothes so that you can bring in some new stuff into your space. Maybe you go to get rid of these pans or things so that you can get new things. Like it can be looking like that. It can be upgrading on some stuff there. That's what I think that moon sextiling Jupiter can do. Is it's not as strong as the trine, of course, but it's still beneficial. It can create these opportunities that show up with the sextile. Again, opportunities for large gifts. Maybe this could be changing up. With that moon opposing the sun, maybe you're looking at some sort of like health habit, for example, and you go like, what? If I remember when I used to smoke cigarettes, and when I quit, I had downloaded this app to keep track of like okay, this is the money that I would spend, and it kept track of how much money I spent, and it was just like, oh wow, over time that makes a difference. And that's the thing with Jupiter. Like I was saying, Jupiter gives in like kind of like large quantities over time, but it's something that you kind of have to build up there. You have to have faith, and to keep that kind of diligence there. But it can definitely, this feels like something that pays off in the long run. They're looking at really kind of reflecting on the decisions that we're making. Are they in that soul alignment? Do they promote more abundance in my life, or do they promote blockages? Are they promoting any sort of like hindrances and things like that? Because then we get to the next aspect, next day. This is where tensions start to, things get a little tense there, because on the 6th of November, that's a Thursday, before the moon enters into Gemini, the moon will form a sextile with Saturn. And like I was saying, so we just had that sort of contemplation, the day before, thinking about what are maybe some things that could change. Maybe there's something in, maybe you want to start saving up so you can move. Maybe there's, whatever that is. But Saturn, even though the moon is sextiling Saturn, and that's an easy aspect, it's still Saturn. And that Saturn, yes, can bring honors, can bring great reputation, can bring that sort of like management of other people and just other people's things. But that's just more where that's okay, cool, but that's more responsibility. That it doesn't like, when we have goals for like, okay, I want to get to X amount of salary, now it's like I got to maintain that. There's always work, there's diligence, and in even achieving that thing, there's a level of discipline, there's a strictness that is required of Saturn, in order to do those things regularly. But this could feel, even though there's that weight and that responsibility, those hindrances, like, oh, I gotta do this thing. Let's say you're trying to learn an instrument, you got to put in the time to do that. But you put in those reps, you do that regularly, then you're you're an expert. And so then it's there's a sense of accomplishment and reward. I think that can come with this energy, but it's still, I think it can create, the sextile can create the capacity to deal with Saturn stuff, because sometimes you just don't want to be bothered. But there are other days where it's like, what, all right, it's not going to be fun, but at least I feel motivated right now. So let me do it while the motivation's here. Because then the moon is going to enter into Gemini. And then that's going to happen at about 7:20 a.m. Pacific time. And I got that on the chart here if you're watching that. This one was kind of a there's a slight little bummer, that kind of that sort of when I was looking at this, because it's like the moon enters into there, and Venus is really about to be on its way out. This the Venus this has the moon has about 7 hours that the moon will spend with Venus in a sign-based trine before Venus moves out. I think it moves out at about 2:39 p.m. or yeah 2:39 p.m. Pacific times when Venus moves into Scorpio. And then once Venus is gone, then it's just the moon and Mars. The, you know, Thankfully with oh no, not even as I say. I think the moon. Well, I was looking to see when the moon was going to be exactly trying Mars, and Venus will have already been, or excuse me, opposed Mars. And thankfully, Venus is still present for that opposition with Mars. So that's at least something. Because when the moon opposes Mars, this can be, it can be tension. It can be something where something gets like lost, like maybe you happen to, and it can be just like minor annoyances, maybe like you lose a key, or maybe you happen to misplace something, or this could be, maybe there's some things going on in your city, like the moon is looking at what is aggravating, what's been inflamed, what's been going on. I've been noticing some things around the neighborhood that that's different than what it used to be. Like things are changing. And that's got me thinking about some things. And with the just thinking about the moon in Gemini, let me backtrack a little bit. Gemini is ruled by Mercury. It's about to station retrograde. We're about 2-3 days away, and is the mutable air sign, and is one of the diurnal signs, so it's active in nature. And Gemini can be busy energy. And this is one where, oh, and something I should have mentioned before if I didn't mention, if you have fixed placements, when the moon's in Taurus, that's going to be Leo, Scorpio, Aquarius, or Taurus. That moon may be working more personally with you. And with the moon in Gemini, if you have Gemini, Virgo, Sag, or Pisces placements, those may be working more personally with you. And how that can even look, for example. Like this is actually a really kind of nice chart because my moon is at 0 degrees and 14 minutes of Gemini. So the moon is actually, I'm having a lunar return around that time. But as you will see, Mars would have just opposed my natal moon, and so that's not great because Mercury is one of the time lords for my Gemini house is activated this year, and I have the moon there, and so that's something that I've been kind of looking at. I see, well, not kind of. I've been definitely looking at, and that'll be hopefully the mitigation will be set. We'll see how that manifests, but that's what that can kind of mean. Like it's like seeing where there are certain points that are being activated, especially like one of your lights. Yeah, definitely keep an eye on that. And that's something to think about. But Mars opposing the moon, Mars is, it's a lesser malefic. It's the oppositions can be adversity. That they're tough. When we're working with them, and that moon's probably trying to make sense of that toughness. Whatever has happened. And it's especially too considering that again Mercury's slowing down. It basically stopped at this point. It's not going past 6 degrees. So it's like it's sensing that maybe the energy's moving, and if it's not something that you've maybe you're noticing people around you are moving different. There's a change in the ether, the shift is getting ready to happen. There may be just again with that moon in Gemini, just general busyness. This is whatever that might look like for you. I just see that like it gives me this energy of like where if you've ever knocked down a hornet's nest, that's something. That's what it gives me. That sort of feeling. And Mars is in a fire sign, and something to think about too. It's been about, because when was the last time that Mars was first entered into Sag? Mars was in Sag last time at about, it was around November 23rd or November 24th of 2023. And then whenever let me see, I don't want to do all that. But but it's been a minute since the moon's had this conversation with Mars in this sign. When it had this opposition to Mars in Sag. And so, thinking back what was happening around that period of time, that's interesting. So I kind of have an idea what's going on. But yeah, that can be something where even going back like that, that's where what's good with these kind of like outer planets when we're talking like Mars and Jupiter and Saturn. I'm working with talk about the classical planets. It can give you the help you give that perspective because you've done that before. They depending how many laps you've done on this journey. So but this is it's been a minute since the moon's talked with Mars like this. And then Saturn's in a different position now. Like things have obviously, certain things on the landscape have changed, but this signature is the same. So it's like what's different, in this scenario here. And that's where looking at these areas of your chart can really help you give the information that you're looking for when you're kind of navigating this space. But then we get to Friday, the 7th of November, and we're in a waning gibbous phase. The moon's starting to diminish in light there, but now the moon is squaring Saturn. And now it goes from maybe having that capacity to deal with that Saturnian thing to now, whatever, that opposition with Mars wasn't great, and so now maybe there's this feeling of it's just been now the motivation's gone. Now it's like it just like it was there and it left as quick as it came. It can be Saturn can be discouraging sometimes. It can be this sense of like, you're just something's denied. Just like especially if you have like night charts. Saturn goes to work. It's a little different than with Mars stuff. Where Mars is more active and more acute. And it's fast. I've been reflecting on that as I have Mars in the first house, and where I haven't had like crazy injuries, I do get a lot of nicks and cuts, and I've dropped things, and I've never had really long term things, but it's been acute things. Like I remember I took a gallon water bottle and it fell on my foot, just like really crazy things. So it's like Saturn though, so it can feel long and drawn out and just miserable, and I get that difference, because for me, I'm having a day chart. I'm like, okay, Saturn, we're just playing long game. Fine, we're just playing long game. It's no different than waiting for Jupiter, whatever, But I can get where it's like, if that's something where if this blockage is really kind of got thrown you for a loop, that can be depressing. It can leave you feeling this sense of yeah, just restrained by Saturn. And so this would be a time to make sure, especially considering that Saturn's in the overcoming position in this one. It's happened at 25 degrees and 30 minutes of Gemini and Saturn in Pisces. But yeah, this is one where be mindful of where your thoughts are going. I say with that moon in Gemini, talk about these things that can sometimes help, even if someone presents like maybe an opportunity, a perspective that you didn't see. Journaling can be a really great thing to just see where the thoughts are at, to be kind to yourself, while you're doing this. Keep busy. Like with the moon in Gemini, do something constructive, doing something that can help you maybe take your mind off of things, where you're not getting trapped in the mind, where it doesn't feel like a prison. I think the malefics can be imprisoning. It's again, especially considering like right now, this is one of those things. The moon it's not being seen by the benefics, while the moon has been going through Gemini. The moon's been it's just been just tough conversations. Not even no, only Mercury is trying to understand all of this, and so yeah, this is really kind of an interesting little pocket here, as we're getting into this, but things change, and I think that's something to remember with the moon. Things always change, because then we get to Saturday, the 8th of November, and the moon enters into its home. It gets into Cancer at about 7:06 a.m. Pacific time, and it's just like yes, it's like the after that, because that was hard, going through that little chapter, that little pocket, those kind of 2 days. But this is where the moon's now at home. It's in its domicile. Cancer is the cardinal water sign. It's one of the nocturnal signs. So this is a time to really kind of get into the body, to just feel what happened. And with the moon trining Venus, do something to take care of yourself. Allow yourself to, this is if there's been a lot going on, having someone who's there to just like, I think that comrade who will go deep with you, who will allow that kind of space to just like, hey, let me just tell you, let me just tell you what happened, this has been crazy, blah blah, like it's, and to create that safe space to be vulnerable. I think with Venus, Venus is that being receptive to nourishment. The moon is very nurturing, or very very nursing, but with Venus, it's like you have to be receptive to that. And again, both of them are in those nocturnal energies. And so it's learning how to, how did that feel in the body? How did that show up? How did that maybe frustration show up in the body? Where did you feel that sluggishness? Where does it feel constrained? Did it feel tight in the chest, or did it feel like there's something in the legs? What was that like, and how do you nurture yourself through that? I think that's a very important thing, and I think a very powerful thing that the moon gets to do. And again, the moon is special because the moon, where it moves fast, it goes through its home sign once a month. Mars won't be back in Scorpio for another 2 years. Venus won't be back in Libra for a while. So it's, but the moon, we get this energy every month. And that's really, I think that's really nice. That's really cool. And yeah, Venus won't be back into Libra until August, August of 2026. So, you know, and it's co-present with Jupiter right now, which we'll definitely talk about here. I think we talk about that. Do we talk about that next? Not yet, not yet. But we can move it on into Sunday, because then the moon is going to form a trine with the sun. And I like that because, again, this is where the soul's light is feeling more in alignment in the body. This is a time to, I think it can be a really great time to kind of do things that help you just to get into yourself, to allow your space. The moon is really, can be associated with the breath. And breathing is a very regular thing that a lot of the time we don't think about, we just do. But when you take those moments for conscious breaths, those can be very centering. And so having that space to just be comfortable in your skin, to be comfortable in the body and feel through, to observe, not necessarily even get lost in the thoughts. There's really no air energy. There's not even really, there's no air energy in this chart right now. There's nothing, it's just water and then some fire here. And this is something too, this would be a really great time to kind of be mindful, because this is now we're in a space where Mercury has stationed retrograde now. This is, this is, this is going to be an interesting energy that we're in, because now, as you see here too, Mars is forming a conjunction, or getting close to forming with that conjunction with Mercury. They're almost get within that 3-degree range. And this is happening in fire energy. So I think that being able to be in oneself and be able to control how one reacts, I think, being able to, because I'm someone who has a lot of fire energy, and I know where I've noticed over the years where when I get really riled up, it's just like it sits in my body, and I feel like one of those cats with their hair standing on the edge. And it's like understanding how to be in that, and how to move that constructively, and to move that in a healthy manner, as opposed to letting it be something that is explosive. But I think the moon trining the sun can be a great regulating energy, taking time to do things for yourself. Now, the last day, Monday, is really busy. We got the 10th of the 10th of November. And before the moon enters into Leo, the moon's going to form that conjunction with Jupiter, and that's going to happen at about 1:09 a.m. Pacific time. And then just about 30 minutes later, not even, a little less than about 29 minutes later, the moon will form a trine with Saturn. And so there's got this grand water trine that's happening, and I think that it can be a feeling that, okay, we got this retrograde that's going to last for about 20, 21 days or so, and so if this is going to be the feeling for a while, how can I set myself up for the long term? because that's why, again, I think that with when we're talking with the greater benefic and malefic, we're talking about long-term things, things that don't just come just real quickly. They take them, but when I think about Jupiter, being about like inheritance, for example, it takes a while to build up inheritance. That takes work to get to that thing. It takes that kind of those connections. And so I think that that's something with the moon forming a conjunction with Jupiter, again, that monthly conjunction. Who are we connecting with? How do we feel like we have our who are our allies? The people who are in our corner with this situation here. I think that this can, what are not just what am I going to do as an individual, but what are we going to do to get through this stuff, to help mitigate these, work with these sort of long-term implications. And then we get to then we get to the moon moving into Leo, and I have the chart up there. If you're watching that, the moon's going to enter at about 9:39 a.m. Pacific, or excuse me, 9:33 p.m. a.m. Pacific time. To see if I know what time it is. And with the moon in Leo, the Leo's ruled by the sun, and they are the fixed fire sign, and they're one of the diurnal signs. So now we're talking more active energy with Leo. And being ruled by the sun, I like to think of like a moon in Leo, about what's fueling the body. What are some things that you do that lift you up, that you enjoy, that get you feeling kind of energized there, and that starts off, once the moon enters, it forms that trine with Mars. And I kind of like that trine with Mars, because even though it's a malefic, it's a beneficial aspect with Mars. Mars is more sympathetic in a fire sign, but this is more energized. So I think that there is where that can I think that can be very motivating, with this. But with Mars, especially being just closer to that conjunction with Mercury, there still feels like there's a little tension there. Like there's an opportunity, there's a chance to meet something, and then to maybe make something. How do I put this? There's an ability to, because I think Mars gives that sense of courage, that sense of drive to it instead of being inflaming, like an inflammation, it can be inflaming, and something that can really stir us. But I do think that sometimes that stirring can be through irritation. It can be something where you're feeling it because it's just like I have to do this thing. Like something is just like a compulsion. That can be some kind of Mars thing. And I think with the moon squaring Venus, it's that doing that thing that is or I think that maybe the challenge with, or that maybe with that square is, because when it's not channeled constructively, then it can show up as tensions in relationships. Where Venus is trying to still bring harmony in Scorpio, I think that maybe it can do it in a way that is, maybe revealing things, like where it's just like where there's maybe a certain agitation, maybe someone's doing something that annoys you or whatever. But I think that it's as the moon, the last aspect the moon is going to do is form a trine with this Mercury retrograde, now newly retrograde. And I think that there's trying to understand, I think I can go ahead and switch over. But I think it's a getting an understanding of what is to come for these retrogrades, what this period is going to look like, because we're still in the thick of this busyness. On the next day that we'll be talking about this, Jupiter will be stationing retrograde, and so there's going to be that's going to be kind of going on there. And this is something too with the moon moving into Leo. You want to pay attention to if you have any kind of heavy fixed placements. That's going to be Leo, Scorpio, Aquarius, or Taurus. Because those are going to be forming those squares, conjunctions, and oppositions. So, but yeah, this is an interesting week, I think, to kind of navigate in it. I think both in a personal and in a collective sort of way there. So I think this is something that to kind of be stay aware of how things are moving. Just with your friends, with your family, with your whomever you happen to do business or work with, anything is along those lines, and pay attention to these shifts, because I think that having that awareness keeps one where things, life is still going to do things, but I think it keeps you from getting caught up in it, where it could have been a lot worse. You can make a more informed kind of decision there, as opposed to maybe kind of falling on a Mers Mercury landmine there. And so, just something to think about. And you'll see it too when you know that you have certain points in your chart that are being activated during this period of time, and especially watching that moon, especially how fast they can seem fast, but those moon transits can show up when you sit with them. So just something to think about there. But and if that's something too, if you want to know what's going on as far as like what's going on with this Mercury retrograde, where these planets are ingressing all these aspects, because on this one I just covered the moon astrology, but and this is going to be, if it's in the description box on YouTube, depending on where you're watching this, or watching or listening to this. It's down in the description box. There's a link for the Celestial News Monthly, and that just talks about where the sun and the other celestial bodies are transiting, what placements are going to be most affected, and how to most practically work with those energies. So just something to consider there. But yeah, this is that week. So, definitely a mixed bag. I'd say be mindful of extremes. That just what that really kind of gives me is, that's we just there was no real kind of neutral energy there. It's just like kind of like high highs, maybe some low lows, but I think that it's trying to find that sweet spot in between. Again, finding that breath, finding that center in the change, in the constant fluctuation of things. The moon's a great timer for those fluctuations and how those fluctuations are happening. So just something to think about there. But that's all I got for you. So until next time, stay mindful out there. You keep eyes on that moon, because that's nice. I think I'm definitely, hopefully the sky's clear, and I'm gonna go look at that good old moon, bust the telescope out, and I will catch you on the next one. Later.